everyone. Good morning. This is part two of the Great War to End All Wars, in other words, World War I, and our continuing series on modern American history, U.S. history since 1877. So let me continue with this and see if we can wrap it up. Last time I went a little bit long, and I'd like to try not to do that again this time. So let's take a look here at this map. This is a map showing the major battles involving U.S. forces. You see France is in the middle of the screen towards the bottom. It's in a light blue. And of course, it's a little confusing because France is the same color basically as the English Channel and the North Sea. But you see France down below, and you see the darker blue arrows leaving France and going into Belgium. So the Allied counterattack against Germany was primarily through Belgium, as the initial invasion of Germany into France was also through Belgium. Belgium actually got the worst end of this deal. And so you see a number of different conflicts there. I might just point out Dunkirk up at the top of the screen right here, Calais and Dunkirk. We'll see more about that probably when we get to World War II. A dramatic story there. But this is a representation of the key battles of World War I after the United States entered into the conflict. And of course, once the United States sent 1 million men into battle, it was over pretty quickly, and there was a peace negotiations. So let me continue here. The American Fighting Force was modernizing. The expedition into Mexico had helped give them a little bit of advanced preparation on modernizing their forces using mechanized transportation, trucks instead of horses. The early use of airplanes in warfare. There were some heroes in World War I. Eddie Rickenbacker learned how to fly. He joined the 94th Aero Squadron and shot down 26 German planes. Also, Sergeant Alvin York went into the war reluctantly, with some thoughts along the lines of a conscientious objector because of his religious conversion. But he ended up killing 25 Germans and took 132 prisoners in battle in the Argonne Forest. 1/5 of the American armed forces had been born outside the U.S. In other words, 20% of them were immigrants who spoke 49 different languages. 400,000 of American troops were black men, representing about 13% of the entire force. They served in the military. They were serving in segregated units under the control of white officers and were assigned menial tasks. Very kind of disappointing, but such is history. Unlike blacks, Native Americans served in integrated combat units. Approximately 13,000 of the adult male Indian population served during the war, often with distinction. That's about 25% of the adult indigenous or Indian population that were in the war. Due to racial stereotypes about Native warriors, they were given hazardous duties as messengers, snipers, and advanced scouts. Roughly 5% were killed compared to 2% of all the other soldiers. So they served with some danger, some dangerous situations. High-risk assignments. On the home front, fighting in World War I required extraordinary economic effort on the home front. At the peak of the mobilization, 1/4 of the gross national product went to the war production. The key word was voluntarism. Business and government work together in a private-public collaboration. What they mean when they say voluntarism is it was not government mandated. It was encouraged, but not through government mandating. So here's a picture of a poster encouraging people to buy their government bonds as part of their duty as loyal citizens. Government officials were eager to enlist all Americans in the battle against the Central Powers. They carefully designed patriotic advertising campaigns that urge Americans to buy bonds, conserve food, enlist in the military, and join in the war effort. This poster targeted recent immigrants to the United States. So even before the formal declaration of war, the U.S. had become the arsenal of the Allied powers. Thousands of tons of American supplies, guns, grains, and manufactured goods crossed the Atlantic, and the Allies paid for them in gold. The U.S. banks provided capital for investments around the globe. Perhaps the beginnings of the military-industrial complex, I suppose. World War I was especially expensive. The Wilson administration spent $33 billion fighting the war, 8 times more than the Union government had spent during the Civil War. With war revenue bills in 1917, the Treasury Secretary turned to income taxes to raise revenue. So this is where we get our income tax system. The war mobilization required the coordination of economic production. Wilson suggested antitrust laws to encourage more production. In 1917, in July, the War Industries Board was created to direct the military production. Wilson placed a man by the name of Bernard Baruch in charge. Severe cold led to coal shortages in the northeastern cities in the winter of 1917 through 1918. Buell administration took charge and raised the price of coal to encourage production. So in August 1917, the most successful wartime agency was the Food Administration, which was led by Herbert Hoover, a future president of the United States. He was trained as an engineer. Food production rose from 45 million acres in 1917 to 75 million acres in 1918. As soon as the war ended in November of 1918, the government scrambled to dismantle the wartime controls. Wilson was a states' rights Democrat who could only tolerate increased federal government during an emergency, but not permanently. So the National War Labor Board supported the following reforms during the war. 8-hour workday for workers. That's good. Time and a half for overtime. That's good. And equal pay for all women workers. That's also good. So the government's National War Labor Board was coming around to the point of view of the AFL, which was led by Samuel Gompers. He traded his support for the war for a voice in government policy. This also takes us up to the time of what's called the Great Migration, 1915 through 1940. You see a huge migration of African Americans out of the South, where the Jim Crow laws and the lynchings continued. And so you see that they migrated, especially out to the west and north. In the first Great Migration, they migrated north to places like Toledo, Akron, Chicago, Detroit, Boston. So during these years, there was a massive migration of black Southerners out of the South to the North and also eventually to the West. 400,000, almost 500,000 blacks moved away from the South to get away from the abuse and mistreatment and Jim Crow. No, I'm sorry, wrong one. Let me try this one. So then we talk about women and Latinos during World War I. Mexican Americans were migrating into California, Texas, and New Mexico, where they found new job opportunities. Between 1917 and 1920, at least 100,000 Mexicans moved across the border from Mexico into the Southwest. Women were the largest group to take advantage of the labor shortage. 1 million women joined the paid labor force for the first time, and 8 million more gave up low-wage jobs to work in better-paid industry jobs. There was also some political activity going on. Activist women used the war effort to push forward women's causes and campaign for reforms that had been long championed by women, such as women's suffrage, the right to vote. Also, women campaigned for prohibition, a law eliminating the sale and consumption of alcohol, which ultimately did not work. Supply and demand is, I guess, part of human nature. There was an organization called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. 2 million members joined it and supported the Wilson administration. An important person in this time period was Alice Paul, who was a young Quaker woman, and she formed the National Women's Party. She took a pretty militant activist role for women's rights. She graduated from Swarthmore College and worked in a settlement house movement that we spoke about earlier in the progressive movement. She earned a Ph.D. in 1912 in political science and became a congressional lobbyist. She led the National Women's Party to picket the White House, refused orders to move on, and was arrested. The first instance of her getting a nonviolent, organizing a nonviolent protest. She was arrested for obstructing traffic. Paul and other NWP militants went on a hunger strike. I believe there's a made-for-TV documentary or movie about her life. Public shock at the woman's treatment received renewed attention to women's suffrage and put new pressure on the Wilson administration. So Wilson was seeing the women's courage and their insistence on getting their rights. Wilson realized that democracy had to begin at home. So in January 1918, he urged support for women's suffrage as a war measure. It was a constitutional amendment that took 18 months to get through the Senate and another year to win ratification by states. By August of 1920, Tennessee gave the 19th Amendment the last vote it needed, which gave women the right to vote. The elements that helped get the women's suffrage amendment to the Constitution included President Wilson's withdrawal of opposition to the amendment, the women's contribution to the war effort, and the support of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So, this was also a period of strong sentiment in favor of moral reform. Moral reformers concerned with vice and prostitution pestered military officials to keep the army fit to fight. I think that was implying certain sexual things. Training about sexually transmitted disease and shutting down red light districts. 2 Protestant Christian organizations, the YMCA and the YWCA, assisted the government in warning young men and women about the danger of sexual activity. I don't know if that, in my day, the YMCA had a different reputation. So I don't know how well that warning was working. A more dramatic and less welcome intrusion of the feds into people's private lives was prohibition. In World War I, 19 states had enacted laws prohibiting the manufacture or sale of alcohol. Generally, only the industrial states with large populations of immigrants resisted the movement to impose strict regulations on intoxicating beverages. So this, I think the implication here is this was mostly a Protestant movement. Many progressives supported prohibition. Urban reformers were worried about the impoverishment of families, the public morality. They considered the prohibition a benefit to society rather than an infringement on individual freedom. The churches that had the greatest strength in rural areas included Methodists, Baptists, Mormons. All of these strongly condemned drinking. It's greatly changed since that time. Social drinking is pretty much accepted in most of those churches. I don't know about Mormons. In April 1917, Wilson formed the Committee on Public Information for Government Propaganda. The committee set out to create national consensus by molding public opinion. It distributed 75 million pieces of literature. It recruited thousands of volunteers to deliver messages in movie theaters. Recent immigrants were encouraged to become 100% American by giving up their cultural ties to the old world. Concert halls banned German music and operas, including Beethoven, Bach, and Wagner. Hostility towards hyphenated Americans, such as Irish American, Polish American, Italian, or Jewish Americans, persisted after the war. So let's go to our next picture. This is a membership card with the American Protective League, issued May 28, 1918. German immigrants in the United States aroused popular suspicions during the war, and the American Protective League, a group of private citizens, worked directly with the U.S. government to identify suspected German sympathizers and eradicate anti-war and politically radical activities through the Bureau of Investigation, which later became the FBI. There's a membership card. So the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 were the main laws that were passed to curb dissent. More than 1,000 persons were convicted under those two laws. I think it's important for you to realize this, that the censorship and the right to free expression has not always been universally endorsed in our country's history. 1917, in September, the Justice Department arrested 113 Union leaders and charged them with interfering with the war effort. Eugene Debs was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison for publicly claiming that the master class declared wars and the subject class were sent to fight them. So these are some examples of the ship that went on. The end of the Great War left a number of unresolved problems. The Wilson administration had to negotiate a peace treaty and demobilize the troops. From December 1918 to June 1919, Wilson struggled to establish a new international order. Racial strife, labor unrest, and the fear of radicalism broke out at home. So Wilson was very zealous in his attempts to in peace negotiations. He says he approached it with the zeal of a missionary. In January 1917, he proposed a peace without victory, arguing that only a peace among equals could last. He probably was right about that. He laid out a plan for a League of Nations, a permanent organization to prevent future wars. And he had a 14-point program that included national self-determination, a League of Nations, removal of all trade barriers, open diplomacy, and arms reduction. And it embodied the spirit of American progressivism. The only problem was that the U.S. Congress was not interested in going along with him. The League became his obsession. Wilson set out to convince the Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Republican majority was openly hostile. Wilson gave impassioned speeches, but the strain was too much for the 62-year-old president, and he collapsed and suffered a severe stroke. Here is a picture of the new and reconstituted nations at the end of World War I. British mandates, which you see there in the Middle East, along with the French mandates in Syria, the British in Iraq, and down in the Transjordan area, which today is known. Palestine is down to the left there. So we could talk about this another time, but basically the British made promises to the Arabs that they would have an Arab nation free from the Ottoman Turks, but at the same time they also made promises to the Palestinian Jews that were living in Palestine, and those promises were mutually exclusive. I'm sure both parties felt lied to after the war. Then up in you see the demilitarized or allied occupation of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, and Yugoslavia were all demilitarized and occupied. That was representing a good bit of this Central Axis. One of the things to note from, it's not this clear on this map, but basically a number of empires collapsed and dissolved into constituent nation states. The Russian Empire collapsed, but then was reconstituted as the Soviet Union. The Ottoman Empire collapsed and became Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Persia, Transjordan, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Also, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed and broke up into the Balkan states. So this continues the process of the collapse of empires that began with Napoleon and the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. So, continuing right along, let's try to wrap this up. There was a lot of racial strife back in the United States. After the war, race riots revealed that white resistance to the rising expectations of African Americans was as intense as ever. During and after the war, race relations became more violent in both the North and the South. The number of lynchings rose from 48 in 1917 to 78 in 1919, including several black soldiers who were lynched. In the North, there was a growing number of race riots in cities such as St. Louis, where 9 whites and 40 blacks died in 1917. In Chicago in 1919, 5 days of rioting left 23 blacks and 15 whites dead. What a horrible price we pay as a country for the sin of slavery. The wartime influx of 50,000 African Americans strained the city's social fabric and increased racial tension, speaking of Chicago. Blacks competed with whites for scarce housing and job opportunities. Workers also had higher expectations. Economic prosperity had brought them higher pay, shorter hours, and better working conditions. So employers began to cut pay after the war and root out unions. Consumers and native-born Americans blamed workers for the rapidly rising cost of living, which jumped 80%. That's a big jump in inflation. From 1917 to 1919. They were suspicious of the unions, which they identified with radicalism and foreigners. So this produced a massive confrontation between employers and workers. More than 4 million workers went on strike in 1919, 1 out of every 5. Shipyard workers in Seattle began the year on strike. The mayor of Seattle described the strike as an attempted revolution designed to duplicate the anarchy of Russia. The Boston police force shocked the public by demanding the right to strike and form a police union. The governor of Massachusetts was Calvin Coolidge. Future president of the United States, he acted quickly and fired the entire police force, putting an end to the strike. This was enough. This generated enough notoriety and support for him that it propelled him to the Republican candidate for vice president in 1920. Here's a picture of troops, American troops, marching in Siberia, of all places, in 1918, in August of 1918. After the World War I came to an end, Wilson sent American troops from Europe over to Siberia to try to help fight the Bolsheviks and to support the White Russians, that is, the Republican pro-constitutional Russians. And obviously that failed because the Bolsheviks eventually won and united their country as the Soviet Union. This is in Vladivostok. See Japanese Marines standing at attention to the left as American troop history. This begins a period of public fear of socialism as a reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union. Many white Americans opposed the unions because they feared radicalism, in particular the socialist outlook of many recent immigrants frightened native-born citizens. The communist ideology of the Russian Bolsheviks terrified them. Wilson heightened these concerns by warning of a flood of ultra-radicalism that will swamp the world. Politics has always used fear and I can't think of the other word, but basically fear and baiting in order to whip up support. 1919, was the Third International, or Comintern, the Third International Communism. Hatred of the German Huns was quickly replaced by hostility towards Bolshevik Reds. Despite the growing public concern, American socialists remained few in number and had little influence. In 1920, only 70,000 belonged to the U.S. Communist Party. Eugene Debs was the socialist candidate for president in 1920, but he only polled 3.4%. The public and the press continued to blame almost every labor disturbance on alien socialists and radicals. This is about the time that J. Edgar Hoover was appointed to run the anti-radicalism task force that later became known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It's important to keep in mind that the FBI was created as an anti-radicalism task force. 1919, the Attorney General Palmer carried out numerous Palmer raids, rounding up radical citizens and immigrants alike without due process and deporting them. In 1920, 6,000 radicals were rounded up in one night in January. After a failed prediction of an attempted overthrow of the U.S. government on May Day, 1920, Palmer and the hysteria of the Red Scare began to fade from view. Now, this is the first Red Scare. Another one will come along after World War II. Here are some accused anarchists. I'm not going to try to pronounce their names. Sitting handcuffed together on trial for murder. They looked foreign because of Vanzetti's mustache and because of their Italian looks. So, this brings us to the summary. The U.S. entered World War I in 1917 because of German violations of American neutral rights at sea and economic cultural ties. Wilson attempted to use American power to create a just world order. Nice idea, good attempt, but ultimately it failed. The federal government created an army from scratch, boosting agricultural and industrial production and recruiting workers. Some reformers, such as women workers, prohibitionists, successfully used the war emergency to advance their goals. The disruptions of the wartime economy undercut the spirit of progressive reform and increased social tensions. President Wilson's post-war hopes suffered a fatal blow when the Senate failed to ratify the treaty or authorize U.S. membership in the League of Nations. Nevertheless, the United States emerged from the war as a dominant world power. Okay, World War I. Now on to the Roaring Twenties and the interwar years. And I will come back to you tomorrow to talk about the Roaring Twenties and lead up to the Great Depression. Thank you. See you soon. Take care.